The glow of a smartphone screen hides a complex, invisible reality. We are living in the era of the Silicon Shield, where the movement of electrons determines the fate of nations. In the quiet halls of Washington, D.C., and the bustling corridors of Hsinchu, Taiwan, a new kind of Cold War is being fought, not with nuclear warheads, but with extreme ultraviolet lithography machines and high-bandwidth memory chips. The global economy, once a seamless web of interdependence, is fracturing along a digital fault line. We call this the technological Iron Curtain. As artificial intelligence evolves from a speculative tool into the primary engine of national power, the semiconductor has become the world's most contested resource. It is the crude oil of the 21st century, yet far more difficult to extract and refine. Today, a single disruption in a narrow strait or a shift in an export license can trigger a cascade of economic volatility that rivals the Great Recession. The stakes are no longer just about consumer electronics. They are about who controls the cognitive infrastructure of the future. As interest rates fluctuate and global liquidity tightens, the battle for chip supremacy has become the ultimate macroeconomic indicator, signaling a structural shift in the global order that will redefine wealth and security for decades to come. To understand the gravity of this divide, one must look at the concentration of precision. While the 20th century was defined by the geography of oil fields, the 21st is dictated by the geography of the nanometer. Currently, over 90% of the world's most advanced logic chips, those under 7 nanometers, are produced on a single island, Taiwan. This geographic bottleneck represents a systemic fragility in global liquidity. If a sudden geopolitical tremor were to halt production at the foundries of TSMC, the immediate economic fallout would exceed the 2008 financial crisis in both speed and scale. We are not just talking about more expensive gaming consoles. We are talking about the complete cessation of the automotive industry, the paralysis of modern medical equipment, and the collapse of the cloud computing infrastructure that powers our global banking systems. The technological Iron Curtain is being drawn because the world has realized that economic sovereignty is no longer possible without domestic control over these microscopic cathedrals of silicon. The flow of capital is already shifting, as investors move away from global efficiency and toward national resilience, fundamentally altering the risk profile of international equities. The transition from a globalized market to a bifurcated one is signaled by a sharp rise in economic nationalism. In Washington, the passage of the CHIPS and Science Act marked a definitive end to the era of laissez-faire electronics. By injecting billions in subsidies into domestic manufacturing, the U.S. government has effectively declared that the market alone cannot guarantee national security. This intervention has triggered a global arms race of capital. From the European Union's own CHIP Act to China's massive Big Fund, trillions of dollars in liquidity are being diverted from consumer innovation toward redundant supply chains. This massive capital reallocation acts as a double-edged sword for the macroeconomy. On one hand, it stimulates domestic industrial construction and high-tech employment. On the other, it is inherently inflationary. By abandoning the lowest-cost producer model in favor of friendshoring, we are essentially baking higher costs into every electronic component for the foreseeable future. As the cost of capital remains elevated due to persistent interest rate pressures, the financing of these multi-billion-dollar fabrication plants, or fabs, becomes a high-stakes gamble for both taxpayers and private equity firms alike. Beneath the surface of this industrial race lies the ultimate prize: artificial intelligence. If semiconductors are the engine, AI is the fuel that will accelerate the next century of economic dominance. The technological Iron Curtain is not merely about blocking hardware. It is about establishing a compute divide. In this new paradigm, the wealth of a nation will be measured by its total flops, floating point operations per second, rather than its gold reserves. High-end GPUs, like those designed by NVIDIA, have become the most valuable commodity in the world, with delivery lead times often serving as a leading indicator for tech sector volatility. This digital segregation creates a winner-take-all dynamic. Countries behind the curtain face a technological ceiling, where their inability to access the latest nodes stunts their development of large language models and autonomous systems. For the U.S. economy, this represents a strategic moat, but it also creates a massive target. As AI integration drives productivity gains in the service sector, the disparity between those with high compute access and those without will likely exacerbate global wealth inequality, mirroring the divide seen during the first industrial revolution, but moving at the speed of light. The signs of a looming crisis are beginning to emerge in the tightening of global credit markets. As the U.S. and its allies tighten export controls on advanced lithography equipment, a shadow liquidity squeeze is taking hold in regions heavily reliant on foreign tech imports. When a nation is cut off from the technological frontier, its sovereign risk profile shifts almost instantly. We are seeing early warnings in the credit default swap, CDS, spreads for emerging economies that are caught in the crossfire of this chip war. Investors are no longer just looking at debt-to-GDP ratios. They are analyzing silicon dependency. If a country cannot secure the components necessary to modernize its industry, its future growth prospects are downgraded, leading to capital flight and currency devaluation. This is the modern precursor to an economic meltdown, a slow-motion strangulation of the high-tech supply chain that eventually bleeds into the broader financial system. The volatility we see in the Nasdaq is often just the surface ripple of a much deeper, more dangerous undercurrent, where the scarcity of high-end silicon begins to act like a restrictive monetary policy, choking off innovation and expansion in secondary markets. The fragility of this system is best illustrated by the bullwhip effect, currently rippling through global logistics. During the initial phases of the chip shortage, companies panicked, over-ordering components to secure their own survival. This led to a temporary, artificial spike in demand that masked the underlying structural decay. Now, as the technological Iron Curtain solidifies, we see a bifurcated inventory crisis. While older, legacy chips, used in basic appliances, face a glut, the advanced nodes required for AI and defense remain in a state of permanent scarcity. This imbalance creates a liquidity trap for manufacturers. Their capital is tied up in excess low-end inventory that they cannot sell, while they lack the high-end components needed to finish their most profitable products. For the U.S. consumer, this translates to shrinkflation in tech. Prices remain high while the actual performance gains of new devices slow down due to supply constraints. The economic shock is not a single event, but a series of micro-collapses across various sectors, from automotive to aerospace, each acting as a drag on the total GDP. The signs are clear. The efficiency of the old world is being sacrificed on the altar of geopolitical security. The most tangible manifestation of this crisis is the escalating war of export controls, a maneuver that functions as a digital blockade. When the U.S. Department of Commerce restricts the sale of advanced AI chips to specific foreign entities, it isn't just a security measure. It is a massive intervention in the global balance of payments. For countries on the receiving end, this creates a technology deficit that mirrors the structural trade deficits of the past. As they scramble to build domestic alternatives, their R&D spending skyrockets while their industrial productivity stalls. This creates a massive drain on national reserves. In the world of high finance, this is seen as a liquidity drain. When a major economy can no longer buy the tools it needs to compete, its currency faces immense downward pressure. Foreign investors, sensing a long-term decline in competitiveness, begin to pull out, leading to a capital account crisis. We are witnessing the birth of a new economic indicator, the silicon-to-debt ratio. Nations that cannot maintain access to the cutting edge are finding that their cost of borrowing is rising as the market begins to price in the inevitability of their technological obsolescence. Venture capital, the traditional lifeblood of the American tech miracle, is also feeling the chill of this new Iron Curtain. The era of blind capital, where money flowed freely across borders into any promising startup, has come to an abrupt end. New outbound investment screening processes mean that a dollar invested in a foreign AI firm is now viewed through the lens of national security risk. This has created a fragmented venture landscape where liquidity is trapped within political blocks. For the U.S. economy, this results in a valuation bubble for domestic hardware startups, as billions of dollars that once sought global opportunities are now forced to stay within the U.S. and friend-shored allies. We see an inflation in tech asset prices that isn't always supported by immediate revenue. This domestic concentration of capital mirrors the Dutch disease in resource-rich nations. By flooding one sector with redirected liquidity, we risk starving other parts of the economy and creating a specialized labor shortage. The cost of hiring a single AI engineer or a cleanroom technician has skyrocketed, putting immense pressure on the margins of smaller firms that aren't backed by government subsidies. The curtain is not just dividing nations. It is distorting the very mechanics of how we value innovation. To understand how this economic shock works, one must view the semiconductor as a force multiplier for inflation. In modern macroeconomics, we track the Consumer Price Index, CPI. But the silicon CPI is what truly drives the volatility of durable goods. When the supply of chips is throttled by geopolitical friction, the cost of everything from a Ford F-150 to a GE dishwasher spikes. This is cost-push inflation in its purest form. For the Federal Reserve, this presents a nightmare scenario. Unlike traditional inflation driven by an overheating labor market, silicon-driven inflation cannot be easily cooled by raising interest rates. In fact, higher interest rates make the capital-intensive process of building new domestic fabs even more expensive, potentially delaying the very supply-side solution needed to lower prices. This creates a stagflationary trap. Stagnant growth in tech-dependent industries, coupled with rising prices for finished goods. As the technological Iron Curtain hardens, the traditional levers of monetary policy become less effective, forcing the central bank to navigate a narrow corridor where a single misstep could lead to a liquidity crunch in the industrial sector, even as consumer demand remains resilient. This shock extends beyond consumer prices and into the very plumbing of the global financial system, the currency markets. Historically, the U.S. dollar's status as the world's reserve currency has been backed by petrodollars and military might. Today, it is increasingly backed by silicon dominance. As the U.S. restricts the flow of high-end chips, it effectively forces the rest of the world to compete for a dwindling supply of dollar-denominated tech assets. This creates a short squeeze on the dollar in international markets. For emerging economies, the cost of importing essential technology rises twice over, once from the scarcity of the chips themselves, and again as their local currencies depreciate against a strengthening greenback. This is the exchange rate pass-through effect on steroids. We are seeing a divergence where tech-aligned currencies, those of countries within the U.S. Silicon Circle, remain stable, while those outside face a tech-driven capital flight. The result is a widening gap in global purchasing power. If a nation cannot maintain a stable exchange rate, it cannot afford the machinery required for the AI age, effectively locking it into a cycle of permanent economic underdevelopment behind the digital divide. The shock to liquidity is perhaps the most invisible yet devastating consequence of this technological bifurcation. In a globalized economy, just-in-time manufacturing allowed corporations to keep minimal cash reserves tied up in inventory, maximizing their return on equity. However, the technological Iron Curtain forces a shift to just-in-case economics. Companies are now stockpiling semiconductors, treating them as a physical store of value similar to gold. This hoarding behavior traps billions of dollars in unproductive physical assets, effectively reducing the velocity of money within the corporate sector. When capital is frozen in warehouses full of microchips, it isn't being used for research, wage increases, or dividends. For the broader economy, this creates a liquidity drag. Furthermore, as the risk of supply chain collapse becomes a permanent fixture in SEC filings, the cost of insurance and risk mitigation, measured through higher corporate bond yields, rises. We are seeing a risk premium being attached to any firm with a high exposure to the contested silicon corridors. This premium acts as a hidden tax on innovation, slowing down the overall rate of economic expansion and making the entire financial system more brittle in the face of sudden geopolitical shifts. The ultimate measure of this systemic shock is reflected in the real estate market of global tech hubs. From Silicon Valley to Austin, and from Hsinchu to Eindhoven, we are seeing a geopolitical decoupling of property values. In the United States, the influx of federal subsidies and the concentration of AI talent are creating localized superbubbles. While the national commercial real estate market struggles with the shift to remote work, industrial land designated for semiconductor fabrication or high-density data centers is seeing prices decouple from all traditional valuation metrics. This is a spatial manifestation of the technological Iron Curtain. However, this boom comes with a social cost. The extreme concentration of capital in these silicon enclaves is driving up the cost of living to levels that threaten to hollow out the middle class. As engineers and data scientists flock to these subsidized hubs, the wealth effect creates a local inflation that forces service sector workers out, creating a labor mismatch crisis. We are witnessing the emergence of a two-tier economy, one tethered to the high-yield, protected silicon economy, and another left to navigate the cooling embers of the traditional industrial sectors. This internal economic friction may prove to be as challenging for national stability as the external geopolitical rivalry. To grasp the potential for disaster, we must look to history, specifically the 1997 Asian financial crisis. Back then, nations like South Korea and Thailand faced a sudden evaporation of dollar liquidity, leading to a contagion that brought their economies to their knees. The IMF had to step in with massive bailouts, imposing harsh austerity measures. Today, the technological Iron Curtain creates a similar vulnerability, but instead of a currency peg, the vulnerability is a silicon peg. In 1997, South Korea survived by pivoting toward high-tech exports, essentially betting their national future on semiconductors. If the current geopolitical divide had existed then, their recovery would have been impossible. They would have been denied the very lithography tools that allowed them to pay back the IMF. This historical parallel warns us that when a nation's primary engine of growth, whether it was the manufacturing of the 90s or the AI of the 2020s, is suddenly cut off from global capital and equipment, the resulting sudden stop in economic activity can lead to a decade of lost growth. The lesson of 1997 is clear. Without access to the global technological commons, even the most disciplined economies can spiral into insolvency. The case of Argentina provides another sobering parallel for the silicon-poor nations of the future. Argentina's history is a cycle of hyperinflation and debt defaults, often triggered by a lack of diversified exports and a reliance on commodities with volatile prices. In the era of the technological Iron Curtain, a nation that cannot cross the digital threshold becomes a modern commodity exporter, trapped in a low-value added trap. While the U.S. and its partners trade in high-margin AI intellectual property, nations behind the curtain, or on the periphery, are forced to compete on raw materials or basic assembly. This creates a terms of trade crisis. Just as Argentina struggled to service dollar-denominated debt with devaluing pesos, future economies will struggle to buy advanced compute power with weakening currencies. When the tech gap widens, the result is a brain drain of the cognitive elite, the engineers and scientists, who migrate to where the silicon is plentiful. This human capital flight mirrors the capital flight seen in Buenos Aires during their darkest economic hours. The technological Iron Curtain essentially institutionalizes this disparity, creating a world where some nations are compute-rich and others are perpetually data bankrupt. The collapse of Greece during the Eurozone crisis offers a stark warning about the dangers of a fixed-link dependency. Greece lacked its own monetary policy to cushion the blow of a structural economic mismatch. Similarly, nations today that integrate their entire digital infrastructure with a single superpowers ecosystem, whether it be the US or China, lose their technological autonomy. If the technological Iron Curtain falls, and a nation finds itself on the wrong side of an export ban, they cannot simply print their own semiconductors or code their own advanced AI overnight. This is the interoperability trap. Just as Greek banks were paralyzed when the European Central Bank squeezed liquidity, a modern economy could see its entire banking, transport, and energy sectors freeze if software updates or hardware replacements are cut off due to geopolitical realignments. The Greek tragedy teaches us that efficiency in a unified system is a benefit only as long as the political union holds. In a fractured world, that same efficiency becomes a catastrophic single point of failure. The current shift toward domestic silicon sovereignty is a direct response to this fear. The fear of being greased by a technological hegemon. Venezuela and Turkey offer the final, most extreme case studies in what happens when a nation's economic immune system is overwhelmed by a lack of essential inputs and runaway inflation. In Venezuela, the collapse of the oil industry led to a total breakdown of the social contract. In the 21st century, if the technological Iron Curtain blocks a nation from the chips required for its energy grid or telecommunications, we could see a digital Venezuela scenario, where a country's infrastructure effectively regresses. Turkey's recent struggles with unorthodox monetary policy and a plummeting lira further illustrate the danger. When a country loses the trust of the global tech investment community, the cost to import the future becomes prohibitive. These nations serve as a mirror for the silicon excluded. The takeaway is clear. In an age where AI drives productivity, being cut off from the global chip supply is equivalent to a total trade embargo. The economic indicators in these countries, sky-high inflation, plummeting real wages, and a reliance on black markets, could become the reality for any state that finds itself on the isolated side of the new digital divide. The technological Iron Curtain is not just a barrier to trade, it is a barrier to survival in the modern global economy. The impact on the U.S. economy is a story of reindustrialization under pressure. For decades, the American Midwest, the storied Rust Belt, suffered as manufacturing moved to low-cost centers in Asia. Now, the technological Iron Curtain is forcing a reverse migration of capital. We are seeing the rise of the Silicon Desert in Arizona and the Silicon Heartland in Ohio. These are not just factories. They are the most expensive construction projects in human history. A single advanced fab can cost upwards of $20 billion, more than a nuclear aircraft carrier. This massive capital expenditure, CAPEX, is acting as a fiscal stimulus unlike anything seen since the New Deal. However, it is a race against time. The U.S. economy is currently grappling with a skills gap that threatens to derail this resurgence. We have the capital, thanks to the CHIPS Act, but we lack the thousands of specialized engineers and technicians required to operate these facilities. This labor shortage is driving up wages in the tech sector, contributing to a sticky inflation that complicates the Federal Reserve's efforts to lower interest rates. The success of this domestic pivot will determine whether the U.S. remains the world's economic anchor or becomes a fortress struggling to maintain its own walls. This Fortress America strategy creates a massive distortion in the federal budget. To fund the CHIPS Act and subsequent AI initiatives, the U.S. government is essentially engaging in an industrial policy that was once considered anathema to free market capitalism. This surge in government spending, while necessary for security, adds to the national deficit at a time when the cost of servicing that debt is rising due to higher interest rates. The crowding out effect becomes a real concern. As the government absorbs more liquidity to subsidize silicon, there is less private capital available for other sectors of the economy, such as small business development or traditional infrastructure. This creates a dual-speed economy. On one side, the subsidized semiconductor and AI sectors are thriving with high growth and abundant liquidity. On the other, the non-subsidized legacy economy faces a credit crunch and slowing demand. For the average American, this means that while the headline GDP might look healthy, the benefits are concentrated in specific geographic hubs and technical classes, widening the wealth gap and creating a new form of economic segregation based on proximity to the silicon supply chain. The individual's life in the United States is being subtly but profoundly reshaped by this silicon-first economic mandate. As the technological Iron Curtain rises, the American consumer is experiencing the end of the peace dividend, the era of perpetually cheaper electronics. For the first time in a generation, the price of a computer or a high-tech vehicle is more likely to go up than down over time. This shift is driving a change in consumer behavior, moving away from disposable tech toward repair and retain. Furthermore, the AI-driven labor market is creating a competency cliff. For the individual, the economic impact is felt through algorithmic displacement. Companies, under pressure from high interest rates and chip scarcity-driven costs, are aggressively automating middle management roles to preserve margins. This isn't just blue-collar automation. It's a restructuring of the white-collar workforce. The U.S. worker is now competing not just with low-cost labor abroad, but with high-cost silicon at home. In this environment, real wages are becoming increasingly tied to one's ability to augment their productivity through AI, creating a high-stakes environment where the cost of being unplugged from the latest technology is a rapid descent into economic irrelevance. The housing market is the final frontier where the U.S. individual feels the weight of the silicon divide. In cities like Austin, Boise, and Columbus, the influx of high-salaried tech workers and the construction of multi-billion-dollar fabrication plants have created a silicon gentrification effect. Real estate in these zones is no longer priced based on local median incomes, but on the projected future value of the AI industry. For the average family, this means being priced out of their own communities by a tech premium. This geographic displacement mirrors the global technological Iron Curtain. Just as nations are being divided into haves and have-nots, American cities are fracturing into protected innovation hubs and neglected legacy zones. The wealth effect for those who own property in these hubs is immense, but for the renter or the first-time homebuyer, the semiconductor war has effectively raised the barrier to entry for the American dream. This internal economic friction is a primary driver of the populist sentiment currently shaping U.S. politics. As the government prioritizes the security of the chip supply chain, it must grapple with the fact that the cost of that security is being disproportionately borne by the individuals living on the periphery of the silicon centers. The response from the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury has evolved into a doctrine of economic statecraft. Central bankers are no longer just monitoring the money supply. They are monitoring the silicon supply. In this new era, the Fed's traditional tool of adjusting interest rates has become a blunt instrument in a world of precision-targeted tech wars. To prevent a systemic collapse, the government has begun implementing selective liquidity. This involves ensuring that the primary dealers and capital markets remain liquid enough to fund the massive capex requirements of the semiconductor industry, even if it means keeping the real interest rates higher for the rest of the economy to combat inflation. This creates a tiered credit market where strategic industries have a lower effective cost of capital through government guarantees and tax credits. For the Treasury, the focus has shifted to protecting the silicon dollar by ensuring that the global semiconductor trade remains primarily denominated in USD. The United States maintains its ability to sanction and control the technological Iron Curtain. This is a new form of monetary hegemony where the value of the currency is inextricably linked to the dominance of the nation's high-tech exports and its control over the digital infrastructure of its allies. While the Federal Reserve manages the macro levers, the U.S. government is increasingly utilizing economic deterrence through the use of financial sanctions tied to technology. This is where the concept of the credit default swap, CDS, enters the geopolitical arena. Investors are now using CDS spreads to bet on which nations will survive the silicon squeeze. A country that cannot secure an alliance with a major chip-producing power finds its sovereign credit rating under immense pressure. The U.S. response has been to create a stability club, a group of allied nations that receive preferential access to both dollar liquidity and advanced semiconductors. This is not just a trade bloc, it is a financial insurance policy. By anchoring these allies to the American technological ecosystem, the U.S. creates a network effect that reinforces the dollar's strength. However, this strategy carries a systemic risk. If the U.S. fails to meet the supply demands of its allies, the entire club could face a synchronized economic downturn. The central bank's role has thus expanded into a lender of last resort for the digital age, where providing emergency liquidity might one day be secondary to providing emergency access to the compute power required to keep an ally's economy functioning. In the face of this upheaval, the financial industry is developing a new specialized toolkit, the silicon hedge. We are seeing the rise of a new class of derivatives designed to protect against supply chain breaks along the technological Iron Curtain. For the first time, institutional investors are treating chip fab lead times and lithography export licenses as underlying assets for complex insurance products. These instruments allow multinational corporations to hedge against the risk of their tech stacks being deplatformed by a sudden change in geopolitical policy. This financialization of the chip war introduces a new layer of complexity to global markets. While it provides a safety net for some, it also creates a premium uncertainty that smaller players simply cannot afford. In the U.S., the Treasury is closely monitoring these tech-linked financial products, wary of a Silicon Minsky moment, a situation where over-leveraged bets on AI productivity or semiconductor stability lead to a sudden collapse in market confidence. This is the new reality of central banking, managing not just the price of money, but the stability of a financial system that is increasingly collateralized by the high-tech hardware that resides behind guarded borders. The final layer of the government's response is the Strategic Silicon Reserve. Much like the Strategic Petroleum Reserve of the 1970s, there is a growing movement in Washington to stockpile physical chips and raw materials like gallium and germanium. This policy aims to provide a buffer against the sudden stops of the technological Iron Curtain. By holding these assets, the government can provide emergency liquidity to critical industries, defense, healthcare, and telecommunications during a blockade. This move represents a fundamental shift in the American economic philosophy from efficiency to survivalism. For the taxpayer, this is a massive insurance premium. The cost of maintaining such a reserve is significant, and the rapid obsolescence of chips makes it a risky financial proposition. However, in the eyes of central planners, the risk of a digital blackout is far greater than the risk of financial loss. This state-led inventory management is the ultimate sign that the market mechanism has been superseded by geopolitical necessity. We are entering a period where the government's role as the guarantor of supply is just as important as its role as the guarantor of the currency, creating a new social contract built on technological resilience. For the individual investor, the technological Iron Curtain demands a fundamental shift in how wealth is preserved. The era of the passive index fund as a safe harbor is being challenged by the extreme divergence between tech-enabled and tech-deprived sectors. To survive this shift, one must adopt a silicon-aware portfolio strategy. This means moving beyond simple sector diversification and looking at the lithography exposure of every asset. Wealth is increasingly being concentrated in high-compute enclaves. Companies that not only use AI, but own the proprietary hardware and data centers that power it. Investors must recognize that liquidity is no longer uniform. A company with a strong balance sheet, but a vulnerable chip supply chain, is effectively illiquid in a crisis. Survival in this era requires a barbell approach, holding high-conviction positions in the dominant silicon titans while maintaining significant liquidity in hard assets that are decoupled from the digital grid, such as gold or localized infrastructure. The goal is to avoid being caught in the middle market trap, where companies are too small to receive government subsidies, but too large to pivot quickly when the curtain drops. Beyond investment, individual survival in the shadow of the technological Iron Curtain requires a radical reinvestment in human capital. As AI creates a productivity paradox, where GDP grows but middle-class job security shrinks, the most valuable asset an individual can possess is technological agility. This is the ability to rapidly pivot between software ecosystems and to integrate AI tools into traditional workflows. We are seeing the rise of the fractional expert, individuals who provide high-level cognitive services to multiple firms across the digital divide. To protect one's income from the volatility of the silicon CPI, individuals must prioritize debt reduction and the acquisition of tangible skills that cannot be easily automated or blocked by an export license. In a world where the cost of high-tech living is rising, financial resilience is found in low-leverage lifestyles. The individual who thrives will be the one who treats their personal finances like a microstate, maintaining their own reserves of liquidity and diversifying their skill stack to ensure they can operate on either side of the curtain. The silicon squeeze is a test of adaptability, and for the prepared, it offers the opportunity to capture the massive wealth creation generated by the AI revolution. Navigating this new landscape also requires a sophisticated understanding of data sovereignty at the personal level. As the technological Iron Curtain restricts the flow of hardware, the value of unique, high-quality data becomes the ultimate individual currency. In the AI economy, your personal or professional data footprint is a form of equity. Those who can secure their data and leverage it within the protected silicon corridors will find themselves with a level of bargaining power that traditional labor once provided. This is the data equity shift. Practical survival means moving away from a reliance on free, centralized platforms that may find themselves on the wrong side of a geopolitical rift. Instead, the individual must invest in decentralized storage and edge computing tools that allow for local processing. By reducing dependency on a fragile, globally stretched cloud, you insulate yourself from the systemic shocks of a hardware blockade. This is not about being a Luddite. It is about being a digital sovereign. In a fractured world, the most resilient individuals will be those who own their tools of production. Whether those are specialized AI models or localized energy sources, ensuring that their economic survival is not held hostage by a distant export control office. As the technological Iron Curtain solidifies, we must recognize that we are not merely witnessing a trade war, but a fundamental reordering of the human experience. For nearly half a century, the global economy operated on the assumption that integration was inevitable and that technology would be a universal equalizer. Today, that illusion is shattered. The semiconductor has become the ultimate arbiter of fate, dividing the world into zones of high-speed innovation and regions of digital stagnation. Yet, within this fracture lies a profound lesson. Economic resilience is not found in the pursuit of absolute efficiency, but in the strength of our local foundations and the adaptability of our minds. The Silicon Shield may protect borders, but it cannot contain the human spirit's drive for discovery. As we navigate this era of extreme volatility, our success will not be measured by the number of transistors we can pack onto a chip, but by our ability to maintain our humanity in an increasingly automated world. The curtain has fallen, but the script for the next era is still being written by those who choose to understand the new rules of power, wealth, and survival. The age of the technological Iron Curtain is here. The question is no longer whether we can stop it, but how we will choose to live within its shadow. How does this story resonate with you? I'd like to hear your perspective, so feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. If you found this video useful, consider subscribing and giving it a like. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.